Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and it is a real honour to have been invited by the Nuffield Council to present this lecture, not least because I'm quite well known for being opposed to putative national ethics committees, and so they're particularly generous in inviting me to talk to you this evening. It's also true that to be invited to do something like this presupposes a certain degree of, well, if not fame, at least notoriety. And this is often regarded as it were, de rigueur. Joe Wolfe, I don't know if Joe is here, I know he was here. Ah, there you are. Joe Wolfe said this in, I think, his latest book, which I can't resist repeating. Philosophers become famous for arguing for a view that is highly surprising, even to the point of being irritating, but is also resistant to easy refutation. The more paradoxical or further from common sense, the better. End quote. Now, I must confess to having a bit of a weakness for trying to find things that are both paradoxical and irritating to say. And have often succumbed to that temptation, but not tonight. Tonight I'm in deadly earnest because I want to point to some real dangers that I think have not been adequately canvassed. And actually, though I love having solutions to any problem, if I'm at a talk and somebody raises a question, I always sort of say, me, I know the answer to that question. But what I'm going to talk about this evening, I don't really know the answer to, but I hope puzzling it out with you a bit will be interesting. Those of you who know of the great Cato the Elder, Marcus Porcius Cato, will know that he was fond of reminding his audiences, whenever he got the opportunity, that Carthage must be destroyed. Well, I have not a little fondness for issuing that sort of cataclysmic statement, and I'm going to issue, to start with, a version of that. If I was Cato, I would probably say something like the earth must be destroyed and humanity must be destroyed, but I prefer putting the point I want to make in a slightly more reasonable form, and it is just to remind you of what I take to be a truth, as true as any forecasts about the future can possibly be, and that is that in the future there will be no more human beings and there will be no more planet Earth. I take those to be as true as facts about the future could possibly be, and in a sort of Cato-esque way, I'm quite fond of setting those on the table. What do I mean by that? Well, firstly, I think that I hope that there will be no more human beings, not because humanity will have been wiped out, but I hope that we will have further evolved in all sorts of ways to the point at which we will probably not be considered to be the same species by our descendants when they look back on us, with some disgust, I imagine. And therefore, but even if that were not the case, we must hope that it will be the case, because if we are to survive, or rather our more evolved future selves are to survive, we will have to further evolve. We will have to become cleverer, certainly cleverer, more resistant to disease, probably more durable, and so on. And we need to do all of those things because we know that this Earth will cease to exist in about, well, it's only 5 billion or so years hence, but the Earth will cease to exist because our sun will die. And if we have successors that are still around approaching that time, they will need to be smart enough either to find a new world to live on, or indeed possibly, a la Douglas Adams, to construct a new world to live on. So those two facts point to something very important, and that is the importance of science. Science is arguably the ultimate expression of what it's like to be human. But it is also delivering what it may take to transcend, or at least change human nature in the sorts of ways that I've described. Science both celebrates and exemplifies the curiosity, the present curiosity, which I hope we don't lose, of our species. Like less disciplined and rigorous exercises in human curiosity, science is at its best when it's open-ended and undirected. Science also elaborates the state of our understanding of everything that human curiosity reveals. So in addition to answering the questions, or some of them, that curiosity prompts, science is concerned with the point and purpose of all that flows from the systematic harnessing of that curiosity. It undertakes a rigorous assessment of moral, political, social, and environmental consequences. In partnership with science, something that I'm coming to call science ethics, which I think is, if you like, a development of bioethics, I see as that branch of philosophically informed studies that's concerned with the nature, purpose, and point of science, but also with its uses and abuses. In this it differs from and has partially replaced what used to be called, what still is called in some circles, philosophy of science, as the preeminent mode of inquiry into the place of science in society. So this talk, this is a long preamble, this talk is about why we need scientific freedom, if we do, and what the scope and limits of that freedom might be. Now, I've suggested that we certainly need science to deliver on the survival of creatures like us, which for all we know may be unique in the universe, and for somewhere for creatures like us to lay their heads at night. About a year ago, I was privileged to be a speaker at an event that may, without exaggeration, be described as a really important event. And it was at the Royal Society in London, and the meeting was entitled, it was a two-day meeting, some of you may well have been there. It was a two-day meeting entitled H5N1 Research, Biosafety, Biosecurity, and Bioethics. And the stimulus for that meeting, and indeed my interest in the scope and limits of scientific freedom, stems from reflections that I started to form, firstly in preparing a talk that I was to give at that meeting, but secondly in listening riveted for 2 days to what went on. The background was that in 2011, two publicly funded research groups, one in the United States, in Wisconsin, and the other in the Netherlands at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam. We have somebody from that distinguished university here with us this evening. They modified the H5N1 strain of avian flu so that it could be transmitted as an aerosol, so that it could be transmitted in the air by being breathed in rather than by physical contact. Now, H5N1 was pretty universally lethal when transmitted by what, up to the work of these two groups, was the only mode of transmission. Avian flu is not easily caught by humans, and where it has been contracted, as I say, has proved to have a very high mortality rate indeed. The purpose of the research was to enable the virus to be studied more carefully so that, should it naturally mutate into an aerosol form, some sort of countermeasure might be developed, a vaccine or something. But of course, it is also possible, this work also made possible the use of this new form by bioterrorists as a weapon of terror, or indeed by governments as a weapon of war. So to cut a long story short, the two groups, very important stuff. I think it was the American group, the Wisconsin group, submitted their paper to Science, and the Erasmus group submitted their paper to Nature. And the editors of these two distinguished journals, who actually were at the meeting at the Royal Society as well, and I'll come to that in a moment, soon realized that this was dynamite in all sorts of ways. And the journal Science referred the papers to the United States regulatory body. In fact, it's an advisory body, but it's called the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, the NSABB. And the NSABB was minded and recommended that the papers could be published, but with the naughty bits, that's the bits of a scientific paper that explain how you do the technical things, how in this case you could change the transmissibility route, with those, the technical word the Americans use is redacted. It sort of means blacked out. And the purpose of the meeting at the RS a year ago was to discuss over 2 days whether or not this was the right solution. And at that meeting were both research groups and their lead scientists, about 200 people there. The editor of Science was there, the editor of Nature was there, and a few odd people, including very odd people like me, ethicists, who gave some talks about the ethics of all of this. Now, why I retail this story is for a particular reason that will lead me into a peculiarity of the internet, which stretches a lot beyond this. Everything was sort of going swimmingly, and I think the mood of the meeting by the end of day one was that probably, although a lot of people were in favor of, forgive me, I once gave a talk in the presence of Zeke Emanuel, who was head of ethics at the NIH, who saw me pouring some water for myself and said, "You can't do that in a talk, it's a sign of weakness." So I'm sorry for... Zeke Emanuel was the brother of Rahm Emanuel, who is now the mayor of Chicago and was one of Obama's advisors. But he was a tough guy, and he thought you couldn't show this sort of weakness. But you can probably hear I have a little bit of a cold, so you'll forgive me. Well, they were getting to the point where they probably thought redaction was okay, and then I think it was Obama's security advisor stood up to talk, a guy called Bruce Schneier. Now, the great thing about the Royal Society is that everything they do is on the web, free access. So you can put H5N1 into the Royal Society site, and you can see every talk that was given in those 2 days, and you can look at the whole proceedings on film. Bruce Schneier got up, and I want to really give you a flavor of what he said. He started by saying, look, you have to think of security in this way. Imagine, you've got your house is on a street and there are other houses, and some of the houses have burglar alarms on the walls and some do not. Most thieves are opportunistic. So if you've got an elaborate burglar alarm system and you show you've got it, they'll probably, if they're opportunistic thieves, they'll go next door where there's no burglar alarm. But if you make yourselves interesting, if you make your house interesting, and they really want to get hold of what you've got, you'll get a better class of thief who will be able to get into your house. And then he looked round the room, 200 people there, a bit more than are here tonight, very distinguished audience, a few Nobel Prize winners, almost as distinguished as this audience. He looked round and he said, ladies and gentlemen, you all look very boring. Your security is to stay that way. By having this meeting, you've made yourselves less boring. You've advertised the fact that you have got something that nasty people might want. But they said, well, but if we redact these bits when we publish. Surely there's no problem. And he said, gentlemen, ladies, I think he said gentlemen actually, because the two editors were gentlemen, as they so often are. He said, tell me, you think that it's still open to you to decide whether or not to publish this material in a form that terrorists can find? It is not. Tell me, gentlemen, how are papers submitted to your journals? Could it be perhaps that they are submitted online? Yes, that's exactly how you submit papers to Nature and Science. Well, he said, it's too late. It's too late. They are already in the cloud. And somebody like me, I could find them. And I'm not the only person with these skills. So to argue now about whether you wish to black out the naughty bits of these papers so that you can protect the world from bioterrorism is simply too late. To paraphrase a remark recently made by Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, there is no delete button on the internet. Once it's there, it's always there. Now, why tell you this story, apart from its intrinsic fascination and interest, is because I think this is a game-changing fact that hasn't been properly noticed. Let me just go back a stage and start with traditional accounts of the scope and limits of free speech, which is really what is at stake when one's talking about the freedom of science. There is in the literature a famous paper on this topic, which is seldom cited in this context, but I can't forbear to quote to you from it. I'm sure you will be familiar with it. It is headed, and I quote, "In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America." And it sets out, and again I quote, "certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." End quote. It is not accidental that the concept of liberty appears twice in this famous quotation. First, as a so-called unalienable right, and the second time, implicit in the requirement that a legitimate government is necessarily a government by consent. That is, by the freely formed and expressed will of the people. The expression of that will, however, is not entirely unfettered. The scope and limits of freedom have been debated since antiquity, but John Stuart Mill's famous statement of the nature and the obvious limits on freedom of speech and of action provides, I believe, definitive guidance. And let me quote to you from Mill's essay on liberty. "No one pretends," he said, "that actions should be as free as opinions. On the contrary, even opinions lose their immunity when the circumstances in which they are expressed are such as to constitute their expression a positive instigation to some mischievous act." And then he goes on, and I'll paraphrase, "An opinion that corn dealers are starvers of the poor, or that private property is robbery, ought to be unmolested when simply circulated through the press, but may justly incur punishment when delivered orally to an excited mob assembled before the house of a corn dealer." And that phrase nicely encapsulates a guiding principle about both the scope and the limits of free speech, that you can say what you like, but when what you say constitutes instigation to murder or something similar, then you've crossed a line. You've gone beyond free speech. Now the problem, and this has worked very well, I believe, up until now, and I remember reading Mill's essay and thought this is spot on, and for years when I taught political philosophy, which I did for quite a long time in my life, I used to teach this to students as a very good summary of the scope and limits of freedom. But there has been a game-changing event, and that is, of course, that you never now know what audience you are addressing. It is impossible to know that whether or not you may be addressing the equivalent of a violent mob outside a corn dealer's house. We're all familiar with this. Some of you who are fond of tweeting and streaming things onto the web may be streaming what I'm saying now. I have no control. This is a very sophisticated audience in a very sophisticated place, but I can't rely on what I'm saying just being for your ears alone. Now, this is a real game changer. Let me give you just one instance of this and of how widely things are disseminated. Many of you will be familiar with this sort of fact, but I only really came across it just a few months ago. My university collects data about members of the university, like me, who do things that might creep into the press. And it collects this data because academics have to prove that they are terribly impactful and that what they say is jolly important. And part of the index of whether it's important or not is what notice is taken of it. So our press office collects whenever anybody in the university or works for the university appears in the press or the media and so on. And I asked them to let me know what of mine had been in the press in the last 6 months. And one of the things was I had been asked by, many of you will know, I've heard of the Science Media Centre. It's a wonderful thing, also funded by the Wellcome Trust, among other organisations. And it was set up to sort of explain science to society. And it keeps a sort of panel of media-friendly scientists and non-scientists, me included, who are asked for comments from time to time on the sorts of stories that break in the press. And I was asked for a comment actually on the actions of a drug company, and I gave a comment, admittedly, deliberately, to go into a press release and to be circulated. But I imagined this comment might find its way into the Times or the Guardian, maybe a serious weekly. And I thought that was who I thought I was targeting with my comment. And I got the data back from our press office. That quote that I had given them, which actually was being very rude about a drug company. I won't tell you what the company was. It was Novartis. And that quote had received 36 million hits and 5.5 million individual visits. Now, I was staggered by how wide, and it had been published in 230 news outlets worldwide. That is the new game, if you like, of this sort of activity, the sort of activity that I'm involved in this evening, talking to a serious audience, I hope seriously about serious things, has no limits. Has no limits. So what are our responsibilities in what I think is a really game-changed world? Just let me say something about who we are. When I say what are our responsibilities, who is we? One is always asked this question when you say, oh, we should do this. Well, in a democracy, hopefully, the answer is always the same. We, the constituents of that democracy. Those who make the decisions about what will happen. And part of the purpose of the meeting at the Royal Society was precisely to try to decide what we, in the sense of the science journals and the responsible scientists, should do. In an insightful paper commenting on these very issues, John Kramer and Larry Gostin note, and I quote, "The First Amendment to the US Constitution affords considerable protection to political, artistic, and scientific expression, triggering, quote, strict scrutiny by the Supreme Court. The court is most vigorous in reviewing government restraints on speech, what it calls prior restraints, that is to say, saying to the journals, you can't print this sort of thing. Prior restraints are uniquely threatening to First Amendment values, that is to say, free speech values, because they prevent ideas from ever being heard in the first place." Now, Kramer and Gostin also note that in the case of H5N1, the US government's request to withhold information didn't violate the First Amendment because it was a non-binding request. They were an advisory body, a body like the Nuffield Council. They didn't have any legislative or regulatory powers. But that is somewhat naive. But it raises the last main point that I wish to make this evening, and that is, it raises an issue about what the state's role should be in circumstances like this. Now, the late great Thomas Hobbes of Malmesbury, in around 1651, said this about the state's duties in this regard. The office of sovereign, be it a monarch or an assembly, consisteth in the end for which he was trusted with the sovereign power, namely the procuration of the safety of the people, to which he is obliged by the law of nature. And Hobbes had prefaced this statement about the state's role by saying this: the obligation of subjects to the sovereign is understood to last as long and no longer than the power lasteth by which he is able to protect them. So this is the deal, according to Hobbes. The business of government is the safety of the people. That's its prime business. And our obligation as citizens to obey the sovereign, be it a monarch or an assembly, lasts as long and no longer as the power of the sovereign lasts by which they can protect us. So the deal, it's a classic formulation of a social contract. The deal is we get protection from the government, and the government gets our obedience in return. No protection, no obligation of obedience. End of story. Now, one might think, following Hobbes, that a constitution which prevented or permitted the courts to prevent the state from discharging its duty to protect the people had acted unconstitutionally and beyond its legitimate powers. Whether the Constitution was written down, as in the United States, or not, as in the United Kingdom. Of course, this leaves our main question wide open. The question of what course of action in circumstances, for example, like the case of avian flu H5N1, does best provide for the safety of the people. And this is what contributions like this talk this evening are trying to influence. To be sure, the balance between free speech or scientific freedom on the one hand and public safety or the public good on the other is one that must be judged in each case. What is not only unacceptable, I would argue, but surely also crazy, let alone self-defeating, is that this issue should be prejudged in one direction rather than another. Of course, all interested parties, let alone all stakeholders, will try to do this, and it is impossible to say in advance how this process of negotiation will turn out. Even where such powers are in effect delegated to a regulator, this remains true. Hobbes' elegant yet very concise 17th century prose emphasizes a truth echoed in the United States Declaration of Independence, namely that legitimate governments must govern by consent, and that consent is conditional upon the government delivering a number of things in return. Some of those things are clearly the protections that Hobbes had in mind. Others are a set of liberties necessary to protect rights and to promote human flourishing. It is the balance between all of these which is at stake here. And because striking this balance often turns on calculations of probability, assessments of risk, trade-offs between risks of one sort and another, what is being balanced is possibly incommensurable, of different weight, of different value. However, we may be too ready to regard risks and benefits as simply incommensurable and so be unable to make a decision. Curiosity, the desire for knowledge and understanding, the formulation of explanatory theories and the testing of hypotheses has a strong claim, as I said at the beginning, to be one of the distinguishing features of our species, and one that is partly responsible for our survival thus far. Numerous successes in medicine, science, technology, and engineering attest to this. However, recently, as has been shown in a number of influential interventions in this debate, the game has changed. Humans have changed from being an endangered species to an endangering species. But there are also powerful reasons to believe that despite this endangering potential that we have, science may also hold our best hope, not only for the future, but for increasing the chances that there will actually be a future. The challenge is to ensure that science does not lose sight of its part in this social contract, the social contract envisaged by Hobbes and so many other political theorists over the years, namely its vital role in securing the safety of the people. Science is often regarded as a good in itself, and insofar as it is productive of knowledge, and insofar as knowledge is good, it clearly is a good in itself. But this is a weak defense, because good admits of degrees, and because good reasons must of force give way to better. The issue will always turn on an answer to the question, what is best, all things considered? When the things that must be considered in cases like, for example, the H5N1, include the necessity of pursuing the science that may deliver protection against lethal global pandemics and not increasing the probability of these pandemics occurring. The balance is well summed up by Ruth Faden and Ruth Cowan in their contribution to this debate, and I quote, "No society does or should operate with a true zero-risk approach to science, just as no society can responsibly ignore the biosecurity risks posed by some work in the life sciences. The challenge, as all recognize, is to take responsible risks in pursuit of, among other things, public safety. There is simply no such thing as a risk-free approach." The authors of one of the flu transmission studies, the one from Wisconsin, clearly believe that they've got the balance right, and this is what they said in a paper defending their original decision to publish. And I quote, "As we compare the current threat posed by bioterrorism and our past experience with the threat of influenza, we would argue that nature itself should be considered the prime bioterrorist. Viruses emerging from animal reservoirs have killed many millions of people around the globe without the help of direct human interference. And we need to be prepared for other naturally occurring events, similar to those caused by influenza A virus, for example, HIV, SARS, coronavirus, West Nile virus, and so on. Infectious disease specialists have a moral obligation to perform dual-use research in the interest of public health and to communicate the results of their work responsibly." Well, this is fine stuff. And even the idea of nature as the prime bioterrorist has much to recommend it. Indeed, I recall a similar remark from a bioethics text way back in 1985, which modesty does not prevent me from revisiting, and I quote, "The whole practice of medicine might be described as a comprehensive attempt to frustrate the course of nature, of which disease is after all a part, and to prevent nature from killing people in its usual extravagant fashion." End quote. So it seems to me that we are in this bind. The safety of the people requires that we do scientific research. If you like, in that direction lies our salvation. But in doing that research, new threats are created. We can't have one without the other, and we can no longer ensure that where something dangerous is turned up by science, it can be confined to the scientific community and prevented from falling into the hands of the bad guys. Unfortunately, that is no longer, it seems to me, an option. If we are then to provide for the safety of the people, we need a dual or multi-use solution. I believe there can be no principled objection to curtailing freedoms, however important, if the public safety or comparably vital rights or interests are thereby not simply threatened, but threatened to an extent that trumps rights. To switch the index of complexity from pipes to baths, this is a classic baby and bathwater problem. We cannot prevent bioterrorism at the cost of virus research because bioterrorism is not the only or the most likely cause of bioterror. As Fouchier et al., the authors of the Erasmus paper, rightly point out, such terror is also occasioned by so-called natural causes, and we need ongoing research into those natural causes as well. This problem, I believe, is misidentified as a clash between academic freedom or science freedom on the one hand and prudence or public safety on the other. We need academic freedom for prudence and for public safety. Liberty of whatever sort has never implied complete license. As John Stuart Mill, of his own free will, might have said, "My liberty to extend my arm stops somewhere short of your nose." We have seen that solutions to this problem already canvassed in the literature and utilized on the ground. Such compromise, which enables dual-use solutions to be pursued, is not only possible, but is the best, and in the circumstances, I think, the only course. So I think we're left in this rather unenviable situation. We can no longer confine the results of science, even if that were desirable, to safe hands, assuming those safe hands can be identified. We have moved into a world where anything that is digitized is, in principle, available universally and probably permanently, and we never will really know the extent to which what we do has been digitized. Bruce Schneier, the security expert that I quoted earlier, also said at this meeting that anything that has been digitized, even on your computer, even if it's in an email that has not been sent, is in principle universally available. But there are people who can get into computers that are not even connected to the internet. Don't ask me how that is done, but he assured us that it was true, and who am I to argue? And I think this is a game changer for a number of other reasons as well. It means that academics, there are many in this room, professionals, lawyers, doctors, talking as they believe to their clients or their students in the privacy of their office or to their colleagues, may be having conversations which are effectively public. And they will never know whether that's true or not. They will never know whether recordings are being made, whether the conversation is repeated, as it were, from memory immediately outside and streamed onto the internet. We have to accept that everything we say is, in principle, a public statement. Now, that really is, I think, daunting. I used to be quite careful how I behaved with my students, but I'm even more careful now. But that goes for almost all of our interactions, and there, I think, is quite literally no going back from this. So we have to think about how we can function, including function with our normal private lives. The privacy-public distinction is also being eroded, as we find daily from tweets, messages, texts that were sent between members of a family and now produced in criminal proceedings, messages by a son to his father. Recently, you'll know the case I'm referring to, find their way not only into the courts but into the press. We're all potentially in that situation, and I don't think, I'm not the first person to have noticed this by any means, but I don't think the consequences of this for the way we live and the way we conduct quite routine affairs have been thought through. That the distinction that Mill made between freedom of speech, which is simply that, part of freedom of opinion, part of freedom of expression, is fine so long as it is not directed to a mischief, can no longer be made, or at least can no longer be guaranteed to be made. And that, I found it an important distinction, and I don't actually know what to do in the face of the, I believe, complete erosion of that distinction. We never know who we're talking to. How is that going to affect our freedom to do other things, our privacy, right to privacy protected by the European Convention on Human Rights and enacted into law by most European countries, purportedly guarantees the right to privacy. How can that possibly be maintained? Well, it can be maintained to a limited extent, not by ensuring that information is not transmitted, but by ensuring that the improper transmission of that information is rigorously punished in a way that would constitute a deterrent. That works for people who fall within a jurisdiction that can be policed, but not all the people we want to control are happily or unhappily within a particular jurisdiction that we can control. It will work to a certain extent, but not totally. And I actually don't know what follows from this. I don't find myself being more circumspect about the outrageous things that I find myself saying from time to time. But perhaps I should be. In another place, and this is the sort of winding up remark, in another talk, which you'll be pleased to hear I'm not giving tonight, I try to discuss the effects of this fact, if you like, on our freedom of speech as academics and as quasi-public figures, which all professional people are to some extent, and whether or not we can rely on the private-public distinction anymore. And again, I find that we can't, and I just do not know the extent to which this is going to change our life. I suspect very little for quite a long time, except, of course, in those dramatic cases, like the H5N1 case, where something really crucial turns on it. But the final thing I want to say is that because I think that we have moved from an endangered to an endangering species, and that our species, as it will evolve, not a finite thing, its main salvation is in its adaptability, and science is a very large part of that adaptability. The one thing we can't afford to do is to use this as a reason to shut down what are considered to be threatening areas of science, or as some people who have become enamored with the idea of moral enhancement, that is to say, tinkering with our moral personality by using drugs and possibly genetic means in order to make people less aggressive, more sociable and so forth. I think all of these, while superficially desirable, are hugely dangerous. So we have to keep our ability to manipulate ourselves, but be very careful how we exercise that ability. This is about the most inconclusive talk I've ever given. And I have to confess that I am totally ashamed of myself for not offering you a clear, crisp, and irritating, genuflecting in Joe's direction, irritating conclusion. I think the conclusion is so banal as to be terrifying. But it does terrify me. Thank you very much.